So what's been going on, D, as the summer of resistance continues? How you feeling?
Summer of resistance is definitely continuing. Last time we were here, we were talking about all of the ICE raids and arrests, and unfortunately, that is still what's happening. If anything, there are more arrests happening every day. We were supposed to film this podcast 2 days ago,
Right.
but I had to tell everyone that, like, hey, I can't make it because there were arrests happening just down the street from me. It was 10 a.m. Most people are at work. And 2 people were nabbed by ICE, janitorial staff at a building. And then not just those 2 women, there was a young boy working a pupusa stand outside the building, and they picked him up too. And it became a whole thing because ICE picked him up, local law enforcement, LAPD showed up. And then what we're seeing now is there were a lot of people trying to oppose it and, try to get information on the arrestees, because what we're seeing is a lot of community patrols. You can't call the police if ICE is coming because they're helping ICE. And so a lot of community patrols. And so that's why I couldn't make it 2 days ago.
In this sanctuary city.
In a sanctuary city. So it's a lot going on. And I think now the question people have been asking is, how did we get here?
Yeah.
And I don't think people realize that it isn't even just about this presidential term or the ones before it. It goes back to the founding of this country.
Right. How do we get to a place in the free country where people are getting snatched off the street? I mean, in LA alone, they say over 1,500 people were arrested, and most of them are not, quote unquote, criminals or felons.
Right. Some don't even have any criminal record, and they're picking up anybody. I got a text message today from a friend that their neighbor had been arrested, the whole family, including the 8-month-old baby.
Wow.
And that was in South Central LA, I believe either this morning it was this morning. So these are sort of the texts that Angelinos are sending to each other or receiving.
Right.
That this is commonplace. But again, how did we get here?
How did we get here? How is a civil violation, right, immigration, by crossing the border legally or overstaying your border, how did that become criminalized to now where we have a crimmigration?
Yeah.
How did it become criminalized to where now we have a crimmigration system where 8-month-old babies are being snatched off the street?
And I think it's important to see, and we'll get into it, is that the history of immigration in this country has always, we like to say like, oh, we're a country of immigrants, but we don't really take care of immigrants. We don't make it easy for people who come to this country to become citizens. We make it expensive. We make the process long. And then there are so many laws in place historically that limit who can become a citizen. And so when people overstay a visa or people, quote unquote, do it the wrong way, it's because we've never actually prioritized immigrants being citizens. We just prioritize having immigrants be laborers.
Right.
And so we value their work, but not enough to give them citizenship.
And there's always been a hierarchy in this country with who's preferred as an immigrant from its white supremacist founding. So let's start by talking about one of the first laws, the Naturalization Act of 1790, right, which established this racialized foundation of our immigration system. It limited citizenship at the time to, quote, free white persons of good character. It excluded Native Americans, enslaved people. Even free black individuals were not given any legal protections or awarded citizenship. And that's the foundation of what we call the United States. Shortly after this revolution for democracy, for freedom, there's a law that says, well, actually, free white persons of good character.
Right. It's one of those things where, again, it sounds like a good idea. Anybody can become a naturalized citizen, even if you weren't born here. But then they limit it, and they limit it to only who they want to be citizens. And considering that they populated the colonies for the most part by enslaved people, by folks that were sent here because they were criminals, it's just sort of a weird way to automatically say that the folks who are white are probably the ones who should be the citizens.
Right. And other groups had to fight for that citizenship or were explicitly excluded. Like one of the first immigration laws to follow that was the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed in the 1800s. And that was the first act to just explicitly ban a race group from citizenship based off race or which country they came from.
And again, it's because they needed labor, so they got free or cheap Chinese laborers to build the railroad. They came here. They had them come here. They didn't pay them much. It was cheap labor. And then when they were done, they realized, well, now what do we do? Let's just exclude more folks from coming. And again, that's sort of what we see over and over again is this country will let folks in because they need the work.
Right.
They need folks to be the cheap labor, but they don't want them to be citizens.
And a very familiar situation like that happened in World War II, too, in the 1940s when the U.S. government initiated the Bracero program, specifically because we needed labor. People were off at war. So millions of Mexicans came across the border for agricultural jobs and other jobs. But then a decade later, President Eisenhower enacts, quote, Operation Wetback, and literally deports over 1 million Mexicans, many of them without due process. And still to this day, they talk about the death train where many people died going back to Mexico.
Right. And so when people say, how did we get here? We've been here. You know, the immigration policy sort of wax and wanes depending on our needs, economic needs. And so, you know, while we're seeing a little bit more of a authoritarian approach to removing immigrants, we as a country have never hesitated to do so, you know, en masse.
Right.
We've never hesitated to do it in a way that wasn't violent. We haven't hesitated to do it without impunity. Like choosing, you know, Chinese laborers and then Mexican laborers, it's so specific. And for whatever reason, we've gotten, like, the country just gets away with it.
Right. And there's a deep history of our, like you mentioned, economic policies, but also our political policies and our foreign policies abroad that impact other nations and force migration here. And I want to read a quote, or really a lyric, for one of my favorite rappers, Immortal Technique. And he's Peruvian himself. So in this quote, he says, "Invasion and rampant monetary inflation that brought us all to the footsteps of this nation. Peruvians, Haitians, Ecuadorians, Nicaraguans, Colombians, Salvadorians. They called us terrorists after they ruined our countries, funding right-wing paramilitary monkeys. Tortured the populace, then blamed the communists. Your lies are too obvious, propaganda monotonous." So several of those countries, whether it's Nicaragua, Haiti, I mean, several times in Haiti, in Colombia, and El Salvador, the U.S. government officially overthrew or installed dictators, supported non-democratic regimes, and created sometimes trade agreements and treaties that destabilize the economies and force millions of people here. So when you see people fleeing from Central America and from Mexico, it's oftentimes because of U.S. policy and how it impacts them at home.
Right. It's sort of the best way to go about this is, why are people coming from other countries here? Because things are unstable at home, because there's no economic opportunities in their countries, because there is political unrest in their countries. And then you ask again, why are those the conditions? Oh, because we have a right-wing or a dictator or right-wing leader or a dictator or someone who envisions themselves to be a king. Why do you have that leader?
Right.
Because our democratically elected leader decided that they perhaps wanted to cut off their border from the United States economically, because those leaders don't want trade agreements that are unfair, because those leaders want to push United States influence out of their own countries. So if you sort of keep asking the question why, the answer for why people are fleeing their countries or coming to the U.S. is because, as those lyrics suggest, the propaganda is working. People don't like, you know, we, as in the United States, has created situations in other countries because the U.S. is notoriously meddlesome.
Right. I mean, that's a nice light way to put it. With hundreds of army bases around the nation and billions of dollars in military investment, we have a footprint in every country, essentially.
Right. And so while we are protecting our domestic interests, we do so by messing with other, with foreign policy, with trade agreements. Mm-hmm. And so it's very unfair of us, to put it lightly, to create these conditions for people to flee their countries and then not create a sanctuary for them to come to.
For sure. And I think one of the most sinister examples of that is like El Salvador. Because it's interesting how the immigrant community is criminalized so much when research shows that they're actually less likely to commit a crime than citizens.
Yeah.
But specifically in El Salvador, where we have gangs like MS-13 that Trump's, points to and says the bad hombres and the people, and you see the mega prison in El Salvador and what's happening there. But most people don't know that MS-13 is something that started here in the U.S. And then was exported to El Salvador through our immigration and deportation policies by kicking people out and pushing them back into the country, but also with guns and drugs and different things. And that led to El Salvador literally becoming one of the most dangerous places on earth because of what we exported and kicked out of this country. Right. And then now we're complaining that quote unquote gang members and drug dealers are coming across the border. We're looking at tattoos and other things, and people are literally being snatched off the street because of tattoos. And this is a problem that we created. Right. The United States created. We don't take responsibility for it, but the U.S. government contributed to.
Right. And again, we protect our interests, but act like we operate in a bubble. I keep saying we because I am in fact American, but it's hard to say we because I'm also come from an immigrant family. Right. And so my immigrant family, quote unquote, came here the right way. But to do so was expensive and lengthy, and it took a long time. And I have family members that still are not full-blown citizens. I have family members who are undocumented. I have family members who have green cards, who are going through this, who've had green cards for years because they can't get through the process. Right. And so when we talk about the immigration in this country, I think people go quickly into legal versus illegal, right? And so I think people need to realize there are nuances to that. Right. Becoming a citizen has always been hard in this country. We tout, country of immigrants, but we don't say, at the same time, we're not really explaining how to fast track citizenship. Right. Right. Even military members can't get citizenship if they were deployed at times that weren't considered, a time of conflict.
Wow. So you can put your life on the line for this
You
country.
can put your life on the line. There's a story going around now about this 55-year-old Korean immigrant. He came here when he was a kid. He served in duty. He was shot in Panama.
Purple Heart. Yeah.
And he was shot in Panama, and he was given the Purple Heart. He was honorably discharged. But he wasn't given the fast track to citizenship because when he was in Panama, which was obviously a tumultuous time, they didn't deem that to have been a time of conflict. And so he didn't meet the requirements to fast track citizenship. And so, as we know in this country, we don't necessarily...
So he literally got shot for this country.
He got shot for this country.
Wounded.
And was suffering from PTSD. Of course, didn't get many of the VA benefits because we know that, the VA and the benefits for veterans aren't great. In fact, they're terrible. He didn't have the benefits. He was suffering from PTSD, and he became reliant on drugs. So he had a drug charge, he had a possession charge, and then he was so afraid of what would happen to him that he didn't show up to a hearing. A country that is truly great would look at the whole picture, figure out that at this point, at 55, he has a whole family, he's clean, nothing's happening, no further criminal charges. They would look at the whole picture and go, okay, let's figure out your path to citizenship. Instead, he went to his immigration hearings, as he always does, and was told that he has a few weeks to go. Otherwise, they're going to reopen his case and deport him themselves. So he self-deported. He has an 85-year-old mother that he'll probably never see again. And his children live in this country because they were born here. Right. But he got on a plane to South Korea.
a place that he left when he was 7 years old.
So he has no ties to that country, right? Other than his, ethnic origin.
Yeah.
But that's just one story of many, and that's one of the stories that makes the news. And then there's all the stories of the people that don't make the news.
Yeah, the path to citizenship here, even for people who come here legally, is so backlogged. Millions of cases.
Yeah.
And the truth is, most people who are undocumented here didn't cross the border illegally.
Right.
Most people either overstay their visas or are here longer or are trying to go through that process and just waiting for it. Or, like that gentleman got caught up in the system and never was delivered the promise that he was. So we don't have troves of, the coyotes bringing people over the border. Like, that's the immigration narrative that we have today, this crimmigration narrative. And it's interesting, you saw in the 90s, actually, different laws and legislation passed as part of the tough on crime era that really allowed for more offenses to be deportable, that allowed for the criminalizing of immigration systems. The 1990s Immigration Act made illegal it introduced the H-1B visa programs, but it was also a shift towards employment and global immigration with your education background and other things. But there were other parts of that wave of legislation to criminalize people. So in 1996, the quote-unquote Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act expanded deportable offenses, eliminated judicial discretion, instituted mandatory detention, and created 10-year bars for reentry and different things. So this apparatus that we have now where people are getting deported for misdemeanors, or actually a lot of people are now getting apprehended without even having any criminal record. It's coming from this modern system that honestly came from, again, some of our policies that impacted this, but in the 90s specifically, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, really skyrocketed the number of people coming from south of the U.S. imposed border from Mexico and Central America. So some numbers say that there were 3.5 million people in 1992 who were undocumented before NAFTA was passed. Within 10 years after that, the Department of Homeland Security found that there were over 10 million people, so over double the amount of people. And it was because you can see the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, destabilized economies, especially agricultural economies. They say in Mexico it eliminated almost 2 million rural jobs within 10 years, and lots of people were fleeing those opportunities and came over here and crossed the border.
Yeah. I think it's also important to note that I'm going to stop saying we, that the United States tends to focus specifically on where people are coming from. They're not cracking down on, immigration from Western European countries.
Right.
They're cracking down on our neighbors, but only our neighbors to the south. You don't see this big, let's find all the Canadians who crossed the border and did so illegally. So, the narrative that it's illegal, that they're taking jobs is very blatantly about the ethnicity, national origin. And so, with NAFTA, even though that's an agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, the focus was very much on Mexico.
Right.
And just like now, the focus is very much about the Latino population because that's the easiest in terms of optics for the administration to criminalize.
Yeah. And you see different states, different jurisdictions deputizing their agents because another law that was passed, allowed for local law enforcement agencies to be deputized as immigration enforcement.
Right.
Which is whole nother interesting issue in itself. Yeah. But states like Arizona and Florida, you see everyone deputized. In Florida, they have the wildlife and fish people who are, basically like the park rangers are deputized to what they feel like round people up, kind of like bounty hunters. Thousands of people, just being taken away. And you see this in different jurisdictions. And then in states like California, that are supposed to be quote unquote sanctuary states and sanctuary cities, you might see some laws that are more welcoming for undocumented people. For example, here in California, the ability for them to get in-state tuition and have some public benefits in different things. Different local jurisdictions have allowed for them to get driver's license or just find other ways to participate because they're tax-paying citizens, working people who contribute to our economy. But now with this current climate, you're seeing lots of jurisdictions, Texas, Arizona, Florida, and others really ramp up their law enforcement to remove people off the street.
Right. And they're literally removing people off the street. For those who don't know, immigrants have rights in this country. Right. And so if ICE is going to arrest them, they're supposed to produce a warrant that's signed by a judge. It's supposed to be specific to the person.
The Constitution applies to you whether or not you're a
citizen or not. But we're seeing people just getting snatched off the street. The folks that we saw that I saw get arrested 2 days ago, one of them was trying to trying to ask for verification, trying to ask for a warrant, and nothing. So we're now in a situation where these ICE agents who are covering their faces, not showing their badges, are snatching people off the street and choosing anybody. We know of U.S. citizens who were detained by ICE just because they looked a certain way. So we're actually in a situation where my mom called me the other day to be like, hey, you should walk around with your passport because, you don't know where ICE is going to be, and what if they think you're an immigrant? And I kind of had to, call it the immigrant daughter's sort of hubris. I was like, I'm pretty American. But then again, what is American at this point? And so, I can't lie, my passport's in my purse now. I actually said, you know what? I'll carry the passport. Am I at risk? Probably not that much, but we're at the point of we don't know how ICE is going to move. They are not moving like we've seen in the past. Immigration didn't move like this. They didn't snatch children like this. They snatch children like this, but they're doing it so blatantly now.
Right.
They're hitting, LA's, again, one of the first cities that ICE descended upon en masse. Like, they're all over the country, but the way they descended on LA, I get notifications for ICE sightings. And if I were to pay attention to every single one,
they're everywhere.
They're everywhere. There was at one point, I honestly got overwhelmed and threw my phone because from where I was, which was at work in downtown LA, somebody was getting snatched 2 blocks away. Someone had just gotten snatched 2 miles away. People were getting snatched, in the same city that I grew up in. People were being snatched from every Home Depot, it seems like, in LA. And so it's overwhelming because they really are just snatching people, and we don't know what happens to everybody. There isn't enough access to the detainees. We don't know, we don't want to move in a way that makes people susceptible. And so it's definitely a very on-edge time in LA.
For real. Yeah. And a lot of people, not just in LA, but all over the country are talking about abolish ICE or end ICE.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't be viewed as a revolutionary or radical thing because think about it like this. ICE is an entity, a government department that didn't exist, 25, 30 years ago. It's something that started after 9/11, after you saw things like the Patriot Act and the Department of Homeland Security and different things emerge. And every president since then has utilized ICE or Immigration's custom enforcement in different ways. From the first... under the second President Bush, under the Obama administration, who really took ICE off the leash and did historical numbers of deportations. Yeah. And his presidency was plagued with all of these contradictions because he did things like DACA,
Right. He gave a pathway to citizenship, which is something people have been clamoring for. But then Obama's numbers in terms of deportations was astronomical compared to, to administrations before that.
And even Trump. He trumps Trump in some ways at the height, and you saw these contradictions in his administration, but you saw a path, deferred action for childhood arrivals, young people, students. I had a lot of my classmates and a lot of my former students, you know, who came to this country when they were 3 and shouldn't have been criminalized and penalized. So some of them had a path to citizenship, even though a lot of it's in the air with what Trump is doing. But the immigration policy or the crimmigration policy continues to evolve because, you know, in 2025 with the Laken-Riley Act that was passed, that further allows for, you know, deportable offenses and different situations where immigration enforcement is empowered to take people off the street.
I want to talk about DACA for a second. I'm very, I guess I'm not surprised, but it's kind of alarming to see how what feels like should be a non-controversial path to citizenship because it's so specific. It's for young people who came to this country as immigrants, who didn't know they were, for many cases, didn't know they were undocumented. It gave them a path to citizenship that was very measured, right? Do these certain things, which is essentially integrating yourself into, you know, into the U.S. economy and society, and we'll give you citizenship, was met with so much controversy. And that just tells you that people really don't understand that becoming a citizen is hard.
Right.
But if you're going to be so upset by young folks, quote unquote, doing the right thing or quote unquote, doing it the right way once given a chance, then the reality is that you never wanted them to have a chance.
Exactly.
And which means what? You know, that means that there are a lot of people who think that immigration policy is don't let anyone who's an immigrant become a citizen. And if that's the framework we're working in, which seems to be the framework that the current presidential administration is working under, there's so many layers of, you know, it goes from, well, what are you going to do about the immigrants who do the jobs that, quote unquote, real Americans have never tried to take up, right? Or, you know, what about the fact that the president himself's wife is here on a visa that she shouldn't have. She has it's called the Einstein visa. The Einstein visa, you have to be like a Nobel Peace Prize winner or like some sort of like Pulitzer Prize winner or something like that. But that's what the First Lady's visa is for. And so we have people subverting the system from on high and then people saying we shouldn't have a system. And it all becomes a jumbled mess. But the underlying matter is it's a very uncertain future for immigrants right now, even the ones that are going through the process.
And there's still no comprehensive immigration reform.
No.
We'll talk about that. Instead, there's just build more walls, deport more people, take away the right to seek asylum. Now it's evolving to where we're sending people to prisons in El Salvador and Panama and other countries.
We're sending people to countries they have no ties to.
Right.
And the Supreme Court just recently ruled that that was okay. And so it just kind of shows that you're not looking at immigrants as humans. You're looking at immigrants by default as illegal.
Right.
You know, we've heard in the criminal system, you know, innocent until proven guilty. It feels like immigrants are illegal until proved otherwise.
Right.
Or until enough people are loud enough to say that that person is needed in this country. And the way that we always talk about whether immigrants are worthy of citizenship is always like the labor. They work hard, you know, they're taking up jobs people don't want, and the value of their work. When the reality is an immigrant should be allowed to be a citizen regardless of their work ethic, because this is supposed to be the land of the free, because this is supposed to be the nation of immigrants. There should be a pathway, and we can't just say that, yes, because of labor. It should be yes, because they are people.
And I mean, the whole nation of immigrants thing was always a conveniently used thing. And we know this is indigenous land where hundreds, if not thousands of different indigenous people existed and still have not ceded their rights to their land and territories to this day. But yeah, this nation was built through people coming from all different places, some forced. I know my ancestors were forced to come here and contributed to the foundation of here. And, you know, even the way America expanded and relates to immigration policies and treaties. So, for example, the Treaty of Hidalgo, which in 1848 took most of the land from Mexico, what we now consider California, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. Basically, Mexico ceded over 55% of its territory in this treaty, but it granted automatic citizenship to the roughly over 100,000 Mexicans who were here, crossed that north border legally, and actually gave them legal protections that at the time Black people and Native Americans didn't have. It allowed them to own land and different things like that. But again, less than a century later, you have Operation Wetback, where you're deporting over 1 million Mexicans and sending them back, and it's a different sort of attitude.
And I don't think people realize is that when immigration sort of expanded in 1965 with that Immigration Act, it expanded in the sense that there were no longer quotas, and quotas used to be put in place saying like only so many people from these countries can come through. They got rid of the quotas, which is great. But what people don't realize is that they're very specific about who they let in. People with like high educational degrees, people who were considered professionals, people who make money, right? So, immigration expansion always comes with like a caveat.
Right.
So the caveat before was, after the Revolutionary War, the caveat was free white people of good character, right? And then, okay, let's open it up for more laborers. But then the caveat is for now. Because what they'll do is enact something afterwards to sort of roll it back once they got what they wanted. And then 1965, it was, we're going to remove quotas, but be very choosy about who we get. And so, and then in the 1990s, it was also the same. Like, more people can come through, but it's much easier for us to deport you. And so when we talk about immigration policy, again, never do we talk about the pathway to citizenship. It's more about how do we control who comes in, and importantly, how do we get rid of folks as quickly as possible.
Yep. And we have to help shift that narrative about it, and even the language we use, and when we talk about people. Like I saw someone post on social media about, quote unquote, we need to get all illegals out of this country. And no human being is illegal.
Right.
Crossing the border illegally or overstaying your visa is still a civil violation. It's not a criminal matter. So, but to call someone illegal, to say that their life and their existence is illegal, is dehumanizing.
Right.
And that kind of language is part of it too. And that's why you see just the abuse of immigrant people. I just saw a video of an elder, essentially. I believe he was in his 50s or 60s, being brutalized by ICE agents. And this is someone who's been in this country 30 years and has 2 kids serving in the Marines.
I saw that video.
And he was being brutalized like he was a criminal, a dangerous person.
Yeah, we're seeing we're seeing knees on necks. We're seeing all of these techniques. It's violent. It's interesting because calling immigrants who don't have citizenship or status illegal and then deporting them for that, like that being the basis for deportation, is interesting considering what about all the U.S. citizens who have done worse things that are actually criminal? If you think deportation is, a solution, and we're just sending people off to who knows what country.
Right.
Obviously this is not something real or that we would advocate for. But, the logic isn't lining up. Because logically, if being here without papers is illegal enough to be sent to a random country, but people here who have actual criminal records, Americans with criminal records, are, especially folks that are maybe even in the White House, aren't seeing any time done, then where is the logic?
The actual criminals.
Where is the logic? Yeah. The logic the math isn't mathin'. So I think it's just important to note that calling somebody illegal is not enough of a basis for dehumanizing.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting to see immigration enforcement and the responsibility shifting and not going towards any corporations or places of business that are hiring, and it's going to the individual. But you see the raids on places of business and different things like that. But there's a well-known fact that, many Fortune 500 corporations and others employ thousands of undocumented people.
Exactly. And again, it's because it doesn't suit the narrative to go after the business owner, because the business owner represents people in power, represents wealth, represents capitalism. And those people, if you say, hey, we went after them, there are a lot of folks who advocate for the deportation of quote unquote illegals, terrible phrase, who probably see themselves in those business owners,
right.
you know? And so the point was to affect, because at the end of the day, they're going to get rid of all, or trying to get rid of all of these laborers, because I think that there's this sort of idea that they're replaceable. Get rid of them now, I'll get more, you know? If we were to actually put some responsibility on the folks employing them, not creating a pathway to citizenship for them, not encouraging them to become citizens or showing them how, then you start going higher and higher and higher up the chain. And I'd put my money on the fact that if you go all the way up the chain, because we are a very capitalistic society in the United States, you're looking at the CEOs
right.
whose money is going towards these, you know, the immigration policy. You see the CEOs who, when they do the calculation, would rather lose some laborers now rather than pay to completely restructure their company and have to pay fair legal wages, higher wages, and lose their profit. So if you just sort of, unfortunately, follow the money,
right.
That's why we're not seeing corporations being held responsible for their role in facilitating the use of, you know, laborers without citizenship status. Yeah.
And it's interesting that undocumented people actually end up paying more taxes than some of these corporations,
right.
but still don't have citizenship. And we're seeing corporations being granted more and more citizen rights.
You know, again, you know, here's a hypothetical pathway to citizenship is that if corporations want to pull labor from other places, maybe create the pathway to citizenship within these infrastructures. You know, like what if you work at a company for so long and they help you along the way, you know, but then there's a fear that once they become a quote unquote real citizen,
you have to pay them more.
You'd have to pay them more. And again, it's the bottom line that is affecting how people are reacting to immigration policies. Those in power are reacting to immigration policies. I live in Little Tokyo, so, you know, there's rapid response teams that have formed in all the different neighborhoods in LA. But because of where I live, I'm very much in the middle of so many. And then people will reach out to me because they know I, you know, work with National Lawyers Guild or have friends at ACLU, including you. And it's just overwhelming, the amount of the way people are trying to notify everybody. Because, you know, and it's sad to see how quickly people have had to mobilize, but you know, I can't, it's hard to say like, but here's the happy, you know, here's the silver lining, but people are, you know, mobilizing to keep their neighbors safe. There's community patrols of people who will just drive around neighborhoods, checking to see if they see ICE presence, or folks that are like figuring out ways to transport immigrants to and from work in safe ways. And folks that are doing mutual aid, you know, like raising money or whatnot to provide supplies or get groceries for folks who are afraid to leave the house, or people trying to find alternative work for, you know, maybe people who are afraid that their workplaces will get raided. And so it's hard to say that there's a silver lining to all of this, but, you know, people are trying to do their best to keep each other safe. And so, you know, we're going to have to keep doing it. And it's hard because it feels like people are getting snatched every day and at every hour, but you know, it's the best we can do for now.
Right.
But we really just need folks to, you know,
remain vigilant
and, you know, pay attention. And, you know, like I said, it's hard to say there's a silver lining, but at the very least there's that.
Yeah. And the truth is, this is nothing new. It's the same playbook in 2025.
Yeah.
We know Project 2025 made some things explicit and aggressive, but there was Operation Wetback where over 1 million people were deported in a year. You know, there were white supremacist immigration laws that were the foundation before the Laken-Riley Act was passed and allowed for people to be, you know, detained for nonviolent issues. So it's new day, same shit.
Yeah.
And we're still here fighting the same way our ancestors resisted. And we're still going to create and expand freedom for people who come after us.
Yeah. And I think the biggest thing I could say as a daughter of immigrants is keep being proud to be from an immigrant family. And like it, you know, there's a tendency now to kind of want to like hide for safety reasons. But if you can, you know, remember that the word immigrant is a beautiful word.
Yeah. Can you just try to imagine the food options here, the music options, the entertainment options, the life, the colors, the textures of this country without immigrant, without people from different nations.
Yeah. So, you know, so it's sort of like it's the community, all the communities are, you know, being attacked, but we're doing our best to fight back. Yeah.
So the summer of resistance continues.
It continues. So I guess, you know, I said it before and I'll say it again. Now's the time for folks to meet the moment. Figure out where you fit in and go ahead and do it.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube or follow us on social media at Your Rights Camp. And tune in as the summer of resistance continues.